Okay, thanks for joining us tonight with Chaim Meiselman on Channeling Jewish History Group. Chaim Meiselman is kind enough to join us this Saturday night. We're going to discuss rare books and interesting Judaica. Let me give you a little bit of a background. He is works for the Judaica Special Collection cataloging. And he's a librarian at Kislak Center for Special Collections, works with rare books and manuscripts. He formerly worked at Towson University in the Special Collections and University Archives, also at the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian, as well as some other places. He is an alumnus of the University of Maryland and studied at Yeshivat Ner Israel in Baltimore. Shavua Tov, good week to you. How are you?
Good, Joel. Thank you for having me. Shavua Tov.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you. So first of all, tell us a little bit about what it's like to do what you're doing, and what do you like most about it?
Well, it's really interesting. Every day, while it's different, it's still involved in the handling of Judaica. I could be handling a manuscript one day at work, or I could be handling a rare book, or a piece of ephemera, or else that could come my way. And I'm lucky enough to work at a place where the Judaica collection is very, very wide ranging in terms of place and date. So one day I could be working on something from North Africa, and the next day I could be working on something from, way into Russia. And then it varies like that, something on the day. So, yeah, I'm very lucky to be able to work in this field.
How long have you been doing this?
Well, it depends what you mean by doing this. By a professional librarian, I've been doing it on since probably 2008 or 9, when I worked with Rabbi Ruderman's collection in Baltimore, a catalog that.
That's interesting. Let's talk a little bit about that. Rabbi Ruderman, for those of you who don't know, was the famous Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Academy of Ner Israel Rabbinical College in Baltimore, which of where you are an alumnus, of course. Tell us, would like to know what kind of book collection did he have? Was he an avid book collector?
Yeah, very much so. It wasn't even his entire collection, but I would estimate that there was more than 10,000 volumes that were owned by him. And then there was another couple thousand owned by his son-in-law, Rabbi Weinberg, in the Rosh Yeshiva after he had been the Rosh Yeshiva. And Rabbi Ruderman passed away in 1987, and Rabbi Weinberg was the Rosh Yeshiva until 1999. So both of their rare book collections were in a very large storage space. And then there was a whole nother segment of that collection, which were volumes rescued from the JCR, the Jewish Cultural Production, which moved a lot of the rare Hebrew books that were seized by the Nazis, and then recovered by the American soldiers. And then there was I could think of a couple other small collections that were in there that had been merged at some point in the donations. So I would assume there was about 30,000 volumes in that collection.
Wow.
In all.
So what kind of, let's say, just to give us an idea, what kind of volumes are we talking about mostly? So let's zoom in for a second and talk about Rabbi Ruderman's collection. Was there anything in there that's not standard Judaica, Responsa, that you found kind of, raise an eyebrow, maybe? Or like, wow, I didn't know he was into this, or he liked this, or.
Well, there was a very nice collection of Hartwick Wesley, Hartwick Wesley, in the collection, and that I think it was the complete collection, if I'm recalling correctly. It's been a while. So that I would assume that would raise an eyebrow. I guess that's how you mean that.
And you're talking about Rabbi Ruderman's collection, correct?
Yeah, I believe that was in Rabbi Ruderman's collection.
Naphtali, better known as Hartwick Wesley, was the leader of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement in Eastern Europe. For those of you who don't know, so yes, that'd be very interesting.
Yeah, there was a very, very good collection of periodicals that's in that collection that they date from Lithuania from between the years 1880 mostly until the war. There's some post-war there too, and the periodicals range from education to bibliography to matters of Torah, which include Sheila to Chuvot, or just Torah articles. There's all kinds of other things in those periodicals, which I haven't seen as good collections in many places of the periodicals in that storage collection. But I would tell you that the highlight of his volumes are in the Sheila to Chuvot and the Responsa. Very, very, very comprehensive. There's many volumes of Sheila to Chuvot that were printed in Salonika between the year 1700 and 1890. And that is remarkable considering he was a Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva. And his interest ranged very far within the realm of Responsa.
Wow, so I didn't know he was out. It's interesting sometimes. A regular Rosh Yeshiva, regular as in someone who's you think his standard interests are in the realm of just classic Talmudic glosses or some things of that nature, and then take a look at his library and you see his interests and his knowledge, I'm sure, was far beyond just that, and included a very comprehensive library. So that's definitely fascinating. Some people might find that controversial, so I guess that wouldn't surprise you.
Yeah, it wouldn't. Again, it's not a open research environment. It's locked, and I was really the style of cataloging was more as an inventory than to make it accessible. What I do now, cataloging is to make things accessible, but in this case, it was not accessible at all, and I don't think that was the plan for it. It was more as an inventory. So it still was very remarkable to me that it was such a comprehensive and large collection and showed a very wide range of reading and knowledge.
Did that surprise you at all, or did you know him?
I didn't know him. I was born 5 years after he passed away.
Okay.
So I didn't get to know him. I met his son-in-law, who also had a very big collection that was part of that collection. As I cataloged it, Rabbi Weinberg, I met him once or twice, but I was very young.
It's interesting, by the way, as an aside, if I can go off on a tangent, Naphtali Hertz-Wiesel, or Wesley, as he's better known, was the of course a very controversial figure for his time. He was trying to institute some reforms, lowercase r, in the educational system, and many of the traditional rabbis were opposed to him, although initially many of them that support him actually. Recently, and he wrote extensively. He was a prolific writer and a Talmudic scholar, as well as a scholar of the humanities. Recently, a rabbi in Israel decided to rehabilitate his image among the ultra-Orthodox communities, claiming that he was unfairly tainted as a heretic. His name is Rabbi Moshe Tzuriel, who's part of the Chardali, or the Musterdox, as like to call it, the community in Israel. And he ignited some controversy recently when he actually republished some of his classic works, the Yain Halavanon, I believe, and a couple other ones. So that's an interesting side, by the way. And here's a pretty, let's say, centrist or right-wing Orthodox rabbi who feels that his work was very much in line and very much meant well to Shem Shemayim. And there's a lot to be gained from his works. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
You get that.
Well, I know everybody, Samson or Father Hirsch quotes Wesley all times. In many different respects. I can't speak to how he's accepted today, but I can tell you that in the printing world, Wesley moved from his Germany area into Eastern Europe and Lithuania rather quickly. There are printings of him that are done in Eastern Europe, and they seem to have moved. So that's one of the things you see historically is that he didn't live in obscurity.
Yeah. I mean, we're looking back and not understanding the full context. It's always hard. The saying goes, hindsight is 20/20. It's actually less so when you're not living in the actual period and understanding the context of the way things are done. And on the other hand, many people, exactly like you mentioned, aren't aware that during that period of time he did gain the support of many recognized leaders of the generation, of the Torah leaders of the generation, as did other people who subsequently are kind of cast aside as people outside the box or even as heretics, like even Mendelssohn. His works were studied by even pretty right-wing Orthodox rabbis, like I believe Rabbi Schick was in Hungary, used to use the Biur, the German translation of the Pentateuch, when he did the Shnai Mikra Targum. And Mendelssohn was a very controversial, remains extremely controversial figure in most of the Orthodox community. I say most because not all. To this day, there are some who think he was a great thinker and a devout Jew, which everybody believes he was an Orthodox Jew, although the term Orthodox didn't yet exist in our understanding. By the way, I have to apologize to all my viewers for this very unconventional way of doing it. We had some technical difficulties with the conventional Facebook Live, so I have to use my phone, and occasionally we'll get pop-ups. Although I will disable the sound, so it makes it less irritating. Okay, so tell us. I mean, personally, I've found your previous employment at the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian very interesting and intriguing. I want to ask you, I mean, all of them sound very interesting. Ask you about what was it like working at the Library of Congress, and did you come across anything interesting that you want to share with us?
Sure. What was it like working at the Library of Congress? It was really, really eye-opening because I had never cataloged a Hebrew book that had dated really before about 1700 or 1680, because when I worked at Johns Hopkins and I worked at the Smithsonian, I wasn't cataloging Hebrew books, so I had my cataloging experience from Rabbi Ruderman's collection, and we're talking Hebrew books and my own collection. So it was eye-opening because for those who recognize this name, this Jacob Schick's personal Hebrew book collection that he bought from Ephraim Dinard in 1912 and then donated to the Library of Congress. And it's one of the really comprehensive collections of the 16th century Hebrew books, which is very wide-ranging and very comprehensive. And it's a very important collection. So I was cataloging the uncatalogued pieces from that collection. And it was, to me, it was really amazing. It was really amazing work. Yeah.
Did you meet any interesting people who are book collectors or manuscript collectors? Maybe you want to share an anecdote along those lines? Sounds like you would run into someone like that.
Yeah, I tend to meet them kind of often in different ways. When I go shopping, for rare books, that's when I usually meet other people. I like to go shopping at Israel Mizrahi store in Brooklyn, for example, and I've met many collectors there in the past. And on and off, I've just met other collectors and spoken to them about their different styles of collecting. I think collecting in general, whatever you're collecting, is very personal and very subjective. But collectors understand other methods and ways of collecting, and they tend to have a good way of talking about it. So it's very nice to meet other people who collect.
Did you? So let me ask you a question. If it's up to you if you want to share this information.
Sure.
What in your private possession of rare books? I'm guessing books. You don't have any manuscripts, right? That you own. But rare books.
I do have manuscripts.
Oh, wow. What do you cherish the most, and why?
That's a really good question, Joel. I mean, I'm looking right now at all my volumes because they're on the shelf behind the computer, and I mean, I can't even think of what I can cherish the most. It's really hard to say. There are different reasons you would cherish something. Same thing as there are different reasons you would buy something or try to buy something. I could give you examples of special items I own, but I can't think of what I cherish the most. For example, I have about 60% of the first major edition of Mishnah Torah, Maimonides, the 1524 printing by Daniel Baum in Venice, and I think that's certainly one of the most special things to me that I own, because that was one of the benchmarks, I think, of Hebrew printing when it moved from printing generally smaller items, and smaller sized and in a smaller format to a major format with commentaries and such things. It's not the first one of such a thing, but indicative of a wave of moving Hebrew print into a more major format. So Daniel Baumberg had printed the Talmud, which I don't know. I don't own volumes of his Talmud. A few years prior to that, and there had been editions of Four, which was also a major work. But I feel, at least, I'm sure many people would disagree, but I feel that this edition of Rambam of Maimonides is indicative of the moving of smaller time Hebrew printing into the major, and this is one of the things that Daniel Baumberg is famous for. So here's an example of something I own, which I would tell you I cherish that.
Certainly. You asked me. I mentioned a book that I came across. We talked briefly about the interesting phenomenon of people traveling seemingly long distances in order to get the works printed in the early modern period. Why would that be? So you see, for instance, I had an example of the chief rabbi, Sephardic rabbi of London, Raphael Mildola, had his books published, at least one of them, Chupat Chatanim, which you said you cataloged recently, was published in Budapest. There are many other examples of people from a completely different location, sometimes a pretty long distance, would travel to get their books published. Why would someone from London travel to Budapest to get a book printed, or Vienna?
Right. That's really a good question, Joel. I think that it depends on what era you're talking and who. I can tell you that there were certain printing houses which specialized in areas. For example, modern Hebrew literature was printed in Odessa, and the writers who were getting printed in Odessa, between in the late 19th century, mostly in the early 20th century, they come from many different places, and I think the publishers worked hard to be able to put together a lot of manuscripts for printing. You have that example even to the extreme with what's known as the Chevrat Mekitze Nir Damim, the organization to print medieval scholars and older texts in manuscript that printed a lot of things in Western Poland. There's a city in Poland that they had a large printing house in. They had other printing done in Vilna and Warsaw. And if you know that Solomon Buber, he was the one who put together a number of their texts. But you see from that example of Mekitze that they were at a time where they worked very hard to put together a very wide ranging of texts from medieval rabbinical figures from Spain, from North Africa, from Palestine, from even Babylonia. I mean, Siddur Ramgon was printed by them. So then you get Maldola. That's a much smaller and more provincial example, but the publisher's name was Katzberg, and I think he was somewhat of a book collector, bibliophile, and he printed a number of interesting titles for Budapest. Usually, the Hungarian printing tends to be, focused on what they're focused on, and it's like you, I was surprised also to see that such a thing like that was printed, because it's a different style of learning than Chubach Hatanim is a different style of learning than probably what they were accustomed to. But I think that you see from there, that's just one example of how the Jewish texts travel. They just travel very far, and they have a very wide range of interests, among Jews of many countries.
Yeah, it's interesting because we take it for granted today that if you want to publish a book, you just go online. You don't even need a printing press, right? And even before that, every city virtually has a printing press. So it's not a big deal. But back then, not too long ago, before the Industrial Revolution, my knowledge in this field is certainly not up to par. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a pretty big deal. It entailed lots of expense, and not all cities had a printing press available, and people would travel, I guess, long distances to raise money. If it was a work of Torah, they would go to a community and raise funds in order to get their words of Torah published. And sometimes that wouldn't happen in their own hometown, so they'd travel long distances to have that done. Does that sound like it's correct assessment?
Yeah, by all means. Let me share with you another piece of Judaica that I have that I cherish a lot in my collection that will highlight what you're saying. There's a volume of Responsa that was printed once called Beit Yaakov. It's written by a rabbi in eastern Lithuania, I believe. The town was named in Yiddish as Zizmir, or Zizmir, and it has a Lithuanian name. Sounds like that. And obviously, there weren't at the time he lived during the middle of the 17th century, or around 1660, 70, something like that. There were no Hebrew books printed that far east. And he had it printed in what was then Germany. Today, the far west of Poland, called Dierenfurt. Today, called Berzeg Dolny. Anyway, so this volume was printed in 1696, and I have a copy of that. is that you see that there are pages missing from it, and somebody wrote in what was missing in handwriting and in manuscript, and they wrote word for word exactly how it is on the original printed page, which means that they copied exactly like a photograph of another printed volume. And the handwriting is in Eastern hand, Lithuanian or what's now Ukrainian hand. Again, early 18th century, early 1700s. So what this means is that not only did the work have to travel from Eastern Lithuania all the way to Germany, be printed, which was for those times very far, but then it moved back into Lithuania or those areas, and at some point it was damaged, and from the missing pieces, whatever owner who had probably spent his life saving them, he had to go find another copy and spend the incredible amount of time writing in the different pages exactly how it was printed, like a photograph. And this is again shows you how precious these sorts of volumes were to their owners, despite everything.
Yeah, you mentioned briefly the Jewish Restoration Organization, I believe it was called, which after the Holocaust, there's a couple of great books that were written recently on this phenomenon. As people may be aware, the Nazis were avid collectors of books and Judaica and items like that. And maybe unlike what we would expect, they did not destroy these items. They, in fact, collected them and they protected them. There was talk about showcasing them in a museum for the extinct Jewish people or something along those lines in Prague. Many of these items ended up in Offenbach, which became one of the biggest warehouses of displaced items that the United States military and the Russian military basically kind of grabbed whatever they could. And Jewish archivists and others came to sort it out. And many of these items ended up in Israel and the United States. There was a book recently written about the famed Strashon Library. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about that. It was one of the most prestigious libraries in Vilna pre-war. It was founded by a very, very distinguished rabbinical but scholarly figure named Samuel Strashon. And everybody used it. Everyone from the left wing to the yeshiva people all sat together, men, women, and just perused the priceless manuscripts and books that were available in that library. And somehow this collection, let's talk about the Strashon Library for a second, ended up in YIVO, even though it didn't belong to YIVO before the war. YIVO was a separate institution. And Rabinowitz, I can't recall his first name offhand, wrote a book recently about this called The Lost Library, which I found pretty interesting. Kind of a controversial topic. What do you have to say about that?
Among many, because Strashon was a fantastic collector in a city that had other libraries, other collections. But Strashon had items of Incunabula, which were printed in the year 1504 in Italy, and Strashon had items that probably had one or two other copies available in the country, even at his time. Not many. And there's even there's a document that I saw that was written by one of the librarians working for the Nazis. It was written in German, and this man had taken an account of the Strashon Library, and this man had knowledge of bibliography, and he made a list of how many titles from which centuries, how many incutables, and so on. And it's remarkable what Strashon did. But beyond Strashon, there were collections in Offenbach that were not known to the rest of the world, but still incredible for who owned it and the scope of them, or just the comprehensivity of them. I found in my work a number of items that remain together all their time that were from the major Jewish community of Mannheim, Jewish communities. And this, the Jewish Community Center in Mannheim had been totally destroyed on Kristallnacht, and I assume that whatever had gotten out had either been taken out by somebody before that, or had been specially taken out by the Nazis before their destruction. This library with a meticulous bibliographer who wrote it in Safrud, in ritual script, each volume, and clearly had a reference to a card catalog. And I found a couple of these volumes with all these inscriptions intact, and they're at Towson University, where I previously worked.
Wow.
Yeah. And this is just one of the examples of the many things that were in often that seem to have survived. And because of that place of putting them all together in one place, and then they moved to major institutions which can inventory them at some point. Despite everything, we could get to see how private collectors worked in all different parts of Europe, and we could see their ways of collecting and where things came from before them into their collection.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about private libraries versus institutional libraries? So most institutional libraries, I'd say, people is open to the public in the sense that they're open about what they have. Although in the case of the Strasbourg Library, Yivo was mum about it for many years. They never mentioned that they had the Strasbourg Library for fear of, for obvious fears of, others coming might make a claim on them. But I get the feeling that there are many private libraries where people have works that are maybe thought lost or something like we don't know what's out there. This reminds me of, never mind printed works. I don't know if this is something that you deal with, but the medieval manuscript known as the Aleppo Codex. Mati Friedman wrote an excellent book about the Aleppo Codex where it seems maybe likely that parts of it were not lost, but are kept in people's private libraries, maybe even in Brooklyn. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm aware of that book, and it's amazing that somebody had a piece of it from Exodus in their wallet for years.
Unbelievable.
The Aleppo Codex. But the scope of things that have been presented in the strangest of ways, never ceases to amaze, and we haven't even touched the surface of what is out there. I saw, I'll give you an example. I saw somebody who was selling things in Budapest, and I don't know where these things came from or who had them before, but I bought them. And they're incredible volumes. Again, they were written in the Holocaust. They have the markings of being part of the Nazi horde. We haven't even scratched the surface of what is out there in private libraries. There are things that turn up in medieval manuscripts all the time that were owned privately. I recently cataloged at Penn. There were 7 volumes of Latin poetry, and they were bound in German manuscripts of medieval handwriting. One of the manuscripts was a Maxer Vitry manuscript. 3 of the volumes were bound in the Tosafot, and then to turn what the disbursement of these materials have gone. But I think that people are already used to the fact that the Holocaust, that Jews in Europe lost their property, and their property was repossessed. Or heirs, and they're just lucky to have it being found.
Yeah, this reminds me of the European Geniza project, I think it's called, where so many works or fragments of works that were thought lost or unknown turn up in the bindings of Christian or other non-Jewish works, right?
Yeah. One of one of my manuscripts was originally a binding manuscript. It's from Catalonia in Spain. It's the early 14th century, I believe, from comparing it with different manuscripts. And this was in a binding of another rare book, and I got it from a rare book dealer in Florida who didn't read Hebrew. He just found it inside a binding. And these are the sort of things which continue to be found in those sorts of places. And there had been one scholar who said that the binding is now the source of Geniza material, for the source of discovery.
Yeah. Well, is there anything, what do you think is the present state, and what do you think is your prognosis for rare book collection and publishing in that field?
Well, it sounds to me like you're asking two different questions.
Right.
Are you asking about people collecting rare books, or are you asking about people publishing about the book trade?
So it's really two questions. Pick either one or both.
Okay. I think people are collecting more now than ever. I think some would disagree with, but I think people are collecting a lot, and people's interests are broadening beyond a narrow scope of what town or city their family came from in Europe or something. I think their interests are broadening a lot to the general sense of Jewish history passed on through the material and the object. And I think that also is true in the academic world and the publishing world. I think that there's a growing interest for evidence-based research, right? Which is like archaeology. It's based on materials, and it's based on actual hard items. Less so than theory. Theory has a place, but also materials have their place. And so I think you get that sense in the rare book world. There's some collectors who need to be careful because they do something that's ahistorical, which is they could repurpose a rare book. They could mix two rare books together to make what they see as a full. But I mean, I would never see that as a full book. I would see that as sort of a sham. And they could put something in a new binding that they shouldn't have. That sort of example where people be careful. You respect history. But I think your question, Joel, I think the world is growing very much. I think people are really high in that field.
Is there any privately held library out there that you're just burning with envy when you're looking at it? I mean, personally, I have that problem with Sid Lyman's library. To tongue in cheek a little bit.
Well, I was lucky enough to be at the recent auction at Sotheby's of the Arthur Marx collection, and I was amazed. I was really, really amazed.
Tell us about it.
I have a special, I guess I would say a bias, but I have a special connection to the early prints in Germany, Bohemia, Moravia. I have an interest in everything, and I collect everything, but I have a special connection to that. And what I saw in that collection, I was just amazed.
Who was this man, first of all?
I'm sorry?
Who is this man, or who was this man?
He's a collector, lives in New York, has been collecting for a very, very long time. I believe he's part of the Breuer's community in Washington Heights. I'm not sure if he lives in Washington Heights, but yeah, I think he's part of that community. And I had only heard things about it, but at the sale, and I own the catalog, you could just see the incredible scope of quality and quantity of what he had. Silver, not just books and manuscripts, silver, art, all kinds of things that are just amazing. For example, I'll give you an example of my favorite piece. Is the first Sidor printed in Germany was printed in Augsburg, in Bavaria, in I think it was 1530, I believe that. And there is not a complete copy in the world. there's a half copy at JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, but this copy that Mr. Mark had, it's the most complete copy out there. It's the second of 2 copies extant, so you can imagine it's something amazing. And the Augsburg printing is really, really unbelievable because instead of printing a book, the Augsburg printed a manuscript. They printed in exactly how it looked like in medieval German manuscripts in a printed form, and it's strikingly beautiful. I got to hold it. I got to go through the pages of it. See, there are 5 different colophons just extant in this copy, which is still missing a drop, but it was not missing much. And it was really amazing. I didn't even know that a person can own such a thing these days because it's so rare. It would only be owned by an institution which would have it for centuries, But this is the sort of thing that just amazes me about private collectors, even in a day like this when things are very, very much in demand.
Have you come across any historical chronicles, maybe a diary or a something along those lines, a narrative that has never been published that can shed light on an episode of Jewish history?
That's a good question. I would have to think about that. I think that a lot of different chronicles would be published by now if they're in manuscript. I may be the wrong one to ask about that.
What about?
But I could think. Let me tell you like this. I could think of many different fragments in manuscripts that deserve their place in publishing, and if there would be a volume of just ephemeratic writing that could lend itself to partial biographies of people. Let's say somebody had a volume in the year 750, and they wrote, "Here I am down the road to this little town where I'm going to meet another Jew, and we're going to make the Hanukkah menorah." And this may be the only record of such a town ever, or maybe this record and another record there in another language. So such a thing, I think, deserves to be published, and then you can form small biographies based on the little ephemeratic writing of people, which also lend a lot to understand the conditions of places and so on. I gave a presentation last year of a manuscript in Towson, which was owned by a Bohel who had worked in Bavaria and moved to Baltimore in Maryland in the year 1862. And this man was documenting each meal that he performed in the American South, all over the American South, and a little bit in the North, but mostly in the South, in the most far-flung places, and on the date, time, and a lot of other details. I think this deserves to be published, and there could be a lot of work done based on just ephemeratic writing that can add a lot to whatever we have already about the history of Jews in the American South. So this is the sort of thing I think that would be very interesting to see published.
Yeah, this sounds fascinating. I hope it is published someday.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us,
Sure.
Chaim Meiselman. Keep up the good work, and I hope to have you on again soon.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joel.
Shavua Tov. All the best. Bye-bye.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.